Hello, this is Professor Zafari, and this will be the first of several lessons in which we are going to discuss the modern Middle East. In the previous learning unit, we discussed the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire ruled the Middle East for several centuries, bringing us up into the 20th century. We've also discussed how the Ottoman Empire conquered well into Europe. So this sets us up with a collision course with Europe. If you remember, it was Suleiman the Magnificent who conquered as far west into Europe as Vienna. He didn't quite capture Vienna, but this marks the westernmost point to which the Ottomans had conquered. So as you can see the map here, parts of Europe, including Hungary, Greece, the Crimea, and the Balkan region, were all conquered by the Ottomans. So with this intrusion into Europe, there was both trade as well as animosity. So as the Ottomans expanded into Europe, new relationships with the Europeans were established. One significant example of this was an alliance between the French and the Ottomans. It was established in 1536 by Suleiman the Magnificent. So what this tells us is, despite the fact that the Ottomans are conquering well into Europe, the relationship between the Europeans and the Ottomans was not all antagonistic. And this alliance between the French and the Ottomans was very controversial. It has been called the first non-ideological diplomatic alliance of its kind between a Christian and a non-Christian empire. So of course this is going to be controversial, and it caused quite a scandal among the Europeans, questioning why France would create an alliance with an Islamic empire. But because this alliance served both the interests of France and the interests of the Ottomans, it did last for more than 2.5 centuries. It ended when the French ruler Napoleon invaded Egypt, as Egypt was still an Ottoman territory, so understandably this ended the alliance. But as Europe goes into the Industrial Revolution, beginning in the 1800s roughly, Europe begins a course of development that rapidly overtakes the Ottomans in its sophistication, in its economic power, and especially in its military power. So with this advanced technology, it is not long before the Europeans begin amassing strong military power and begin using this military power to conquer more and more territories. This begins then the age of European imperialism. So as we can see here in this map of 1900, we see that European countries such as France and Great Britain are dominating great pieces of the globe. As we can see here, the Ottoman Empire is still very much intact, but a much smaller empire than we had seen in previous centuries. But France is colonizing great territories in Western Africa. The British are controlling territories in Egypt, Sudan, Southern Africa, as well as the territory that we now know as India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And for the British, this territory of India was considered the, quote, crown jewel of British overseas possessions. It's a region rich in spices and cotton and all kinds of commodities that are going to contribute significantly to the British, and this is going to have a direct impact on the Middle East. So let's pause here for a moment and look at this dynamic map of the imperial history of the Middle East. We looked at this map early in the semester, but let's return to it and in particular pay attention to who is conquering the Middle East during the modern era. Let's take a look. We remember the ancient civilizations of the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Israelites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Macedonian Empire, and of course the Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire, and right on its heels we will start to see the development of an Islamic empire. It will be the Ottoman Empire that will be the last caliphate of Middle Eastern history. On the heels of the Mongols' invasions, the Ottoman Turks will pick up the remnants of the conquered territories and create their empire. Here now is where we want to pay attention. The Ottoman Empire still exists. This map is not showing us where the outlines of the Ottoman Empire are still intact, but what we can see is that clearly Europeans have developed a sophistication and power that enables them to conquer most of North Africa and the Middle East. The colonization will ultimately establish these new nation-states and borders, many of which we still live with today. So let's return now to our presentation, continuing our discussion of the Middle East's collision course with Europe. As we continue our discussion, we're going to listen to an article that was produced by NPR, National Public Radio. And this article interviews several scholars, and they're going to explain to us the early years of European interaction with the Middle East. Let's listen.
From NPR News, this is All Things Considered. I'm Robert Siegel.
And I'm Michelle Norris, and we continue now with our look at the history of the Middle East and the West. It may sound strange, but this troubled history entered its modern phase 2 centuries ago, with the French general Napoleon playing the first leading role. Napoleon gathered an army of 30,000 troops, and in the midst of the French Revolution and chaos in Europe, he crossed the Mediterranean and seized Egypt. And as NPR's Mike Schuster tells us, this began a long series of European adventures in the Middle East, leading to colonization, resistance, and eventual war.
Napoleon's attempt to seize Egypt in 1798 was pure folly, a characteristic his expedition shared with many in the Middle East that came after. It had little to do with Egypt and the Egyptians, who were then nominally part of the Ottoman Empire. It had everything to do with Europe and his rivalry with Europe's other great powers.
The situation of the Middle East and of Europe's involvement in the Middle East was very definitely a spillover from European diplomacy, European power politics.
Over the next half-century, Britain and France would slowly encroach on the Middle East, always with an eye toward the imperial interests of the other. In 1830, France annexed Algeria. 9 years later, Britain seized the Yemeni port of Aden, near the entrance to the Red Sea, and then set about securing British interests among the tiny emirates in the Persian Gulf. The British moves were mostly to secure strategic sea lanes that ensured their access to their key colonial possession, India. The French move into Algeria would become something else entirely, the first full-fledged European colonization of an Arab territory, says Rashid Holody.
As time went on, what France did was to turn Algeria not just into a colony, but at least in legal terms, into part of France in which only Frenchmen or French women were citizens and only French men had voting rights, and in which the Algerians had no rights or very limited rights, and were gradually deprived of much of their property, which was handed over to French settlers.
Then, after mid-century, the French began a commercial and engineering project that would have a profound effect on the Arab world and Europe's involvement with it, the construction of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal opened a sea route from Port Said on the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Today, from this lonely stretch of Egyptian highway, container ships, oil tankers, and warships of many nations can be seen floating soundlessly through the desert. The canal was opened in 1869, and it only intensified European competition in the Middle East. Again, historian Carl Brown.
It's part of the whole process of the Western sort of spilling over into the Middle East that the rulers of Egypt couldn't really stop it.
After this, the European grab for Middle Eastern territory accelerated. France seized Tunisia in 1881. The British seized Egypt the next year, and 2 years after that, the British attempted to take Sudan. It was in Sudan that Britain suffered a massive defeat at the hands of an indigenous Islamic army led by a local leader who claimed he was the Mahdi. The Mahdi is a Muslim concept of Messiah that has a reflection today in the Mahdi army's resistance to the American presence in southern Iraq. In Sudan, hundreds of British troops were slaughtered, including their commanding general, Charles Gordon, in fighting that lasted from mid-1884 into 1885. Sudan was not the only Arab land in which there was opposition to European encroachment. There was constant Arab resistance in some places and intermittent resistance everywhere. Algerians fought against French occupation from the outset, says Zachary Lachman, a professor of Middle East history at New York University.
As European settlers began to arrive and wanted more land, as there was resistance by Algerians, the war expanded and in fact went on for decades. It was really only in the 1870s that the last revolts were crushed and that all of what is today Algeria was pretty much pacified.
Historian Rashid Holiday sees in this period the first hints of Arab nationalism, a movement that would sweep the Arab world in contemporary times.
There was a religious cast to many of the resistance movements, but reading them in a different light, they can also be seen as simply movements of resistance to external expansion, which used both what we would call religious metaphors and religious language, and also used nationalist or patriotic language, talking about self-defense and driving the foreigners out.
As the century wore on, Arab anger at European colonial control deepened. These years represent the zenith of European domination of the Middle East and indeed of European imperialism worldwide. Ignoring Arab protest, the Europeans believed they were providing the peoples of the Middle East the benefits of their superior way of life, says Zachary Lachman.
This is an era in which Europeans tend to be very optimistic. They feel they have a right to dominate the world. They have a superior culture, superior civilization, and in a way, by extending their control over lesser peoples as they saw them, culturally and later in very racist terms, biologically, they saw themselves as doing those peoples a favor.
Some in the Middle East were impressed with what the Europeans brought, especially representative government and the rule of law. Carl Brown of Princeton says this led to early efforts to reform the politics of the Middle East.
The first constitution in the modern Arab world was in Tunisia in 1861. There was an equivalent effort in Egypt in the 1870s that came to naught with the revolt, the breakdown of order called the Arabi Revolt in Egypt, and leading to the British intervention in 1882. And in the same 1870s, a constitution in the Central Ottoman Empire itself.
In Egypt, the British did not at first intend to stay for long, but, says Roger Owen, a Middle East scholar at Harvard University, events conspired to strengthen the British hold.
They began to think that they could only leave when they were sure that there was a stable government in Egypt, and in the usual sort of colonial way, the more reform you needed to do, the longer the time span when it was thought that Egyptians would be able to manage their own affairs successfully.
The British turned Cairo into a colonial city. Britons took over the property of the Mamluk rulers like the Jazeera Palace of the Khedive of Egypt. It became a popular spot for British officers to play tennis and take tea. Now the palace is part of a hotel, complete with garden dining and a piano bar. The territories that the Europeans seized had all been part of the weakening Ottoman Empire. Still, Istanbul continued to play an important role as competition emerged from a new quarter, Russia. And so largely with British backing, the territories known today as Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Arabia, and Palestine remained within the Ottoman Empire. Ethem Eldem is professor of history at Bogazici University in Istanbul.
It is so strategically located that it becomes a problem for Europe. It creates dissension and factions within the European front. Any British move is going to be countered by a Russian one, not to forget the French and whatever. So that is what saves the empire until World War I.
World War I would destroy the Ottoman Empire, leaving the new Turkey, a secular state with its capital Istanbul, a museum to the glory of earlier centuries, filled with cafes and carpet sellers. The Europeans would seize the Arab world that remained. Mike Schuster, NPR News.